Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this second keynote session at ICER 2021. My name is Kevin Kester, and I will moderate this session. This afternoon, we will hear from Professor Michalinos Zembylas of the Open University of Cyprus, who will present on ethics and nonviolence in times of pandemic. This is the second of 3 sessions this year at ICER that are on the theme of peace education. The session will run for 40 minutes, during which time Professor Zembylas will present his paper. If time permits at the end, I will ask a brief set of questions. Unfortunately, due to the time constraints, there will not be an open Q&A, but if you post your questions in the chat box, I will do my best to include them in the final set of questions. Let me introduce our speaker. Professor Michalinos Zembylas is Professor of Educational Theory and Curriculum Studies at the Open University of Cyprus, an honorary professor at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa, and adjunct professor at the University of South Australia. He has written extensively on emotion and affect in relation to social justice pedagogies, intercultural and peace education, human rights education, and citizenship education. He has published very widely with more than 400 peer-reviewed articles and books in scholarly venues all around the world. And in 2020, he was recognized as among the world's top 2% of scholars in the field of education in a report published by Stanford University. Among his most recent books is Socially Just Pedagogies, Post-Humanist, Feminist, and Materialist Perspectives in Higher Education, published by Bloomsbury in 2018. Affect and the Rise of Right-Wing Populism, Pedagogies for the Renewal of Democratic Education, published by Cambridge University Press in 2021, and Higher Education Hauntologies, Living with Ghost for a Justice to Come, published by Routledge also in 2021. I have had the privilege of knowing Michalinos for 7 years now, and I can tell you that we're all in for an intellectual treat for the next 35 minutes. We are much honored to have you here, Professor Zembylas. Everyone, please join me in giving him a big round of applause. And thank you, Michalinos. The floor is now yours.
Thanks for your generous introduction, Kevin. I'm delighted to be here. I wish I was there with you, but maybe next time. Let me share my, my screen. Okay. So the title of my talk is Nonviolence and Ethics in Times of Pandemic, Renewing Pedagogies for Nonviolence in Education. There is no doubt by now that the current pandemic has revealed deep structural inequalities as well as many forms of non-physical violence, such as neglect and discrimination around the world, bringing into sharper focus the words of French philosopher Etienne Balibar, that our world is one marked by the radical inequality of the forms and experiences of death itself. If whole populations are, quote unquote, left to die when a state prioritizes certain lives over others, as seen in the United States and other parts of the world in which members of minority and poor communities were dying at a disproportionately higher rate from COVID-19, then where does this leave us? What kind of ethics and politics emerge from considering the violence that the world has seen in these times of pandemic? How can we critically rethink violence and invoke practices of non-violence in social and political life, especially through education, in light of the traumatic experiences the world has lived in the last 2 years. Over the years, the notion of nonviolence has attracted considerable attention in the field of education as an important pathway to advance peace and social justice. Nonviolence has different meanings in different contexts. For example, adopting a peaceful stance in life, avoiding violence and harming others, people, animals, and the environment, using peaceful means in collective struggles for social or political change. A major conceptual resource of nonviolence has come through the use of international wisdom traditions such as Buddhism, Taoism, and African beliefs that advocate nonviolence as inner work and self-transformation. A nonviolent approach in this framework then focuses on personal cultivation of inner peace and involves converting negative psychic energies internally. The idea is that self-transformation will enable social transformation as well. While I deeply appreciate the idea that inner peace and self-transformation are important for social transformation, my concern is about the political potential of nonviolence in pedagogy and education more generally. As some scholars argue, by centering our approach of nonviolence on the reflexive responsibility of the individual, we background the social and political forces and mechanisms that elicit nonviolent structures to change the world. Let me give you a simple example. No matter how much inner peace and self-transformation one may have accomplished from reflecting on the traumatic experiences of the pandemic, there is no guarantee that this will lead to any social transformation. Here is another example. If one considers the role of state-sanctioned violence in the context of the United States and the deep entanglement of violence, not only as interpersonal and direct, but also as structural and systemic, then one recognizes how dismantling such conditions is not only a matter of the individual. Police brutality, the criminal justice system, violence attributed to poverty, and the neglect of poor populations during the pandemic are just some out of many forms of state-sanctioned violence against the body that cannot be overcome by simply focusing on nonviolence as reflexive responsibility. Therefore, in my talk today, I want to highlight a different approach on nonviolence in pedagogy and education, one that highlights understandings of nonviolence as both subjective and collective resistance to the norms and structures of social injustice and violence. To do so, I draw on Judith Butler's most recent book titled The Force of Nonviolence, which was published in 2020, around the time of the outbreak of this pandemic. And I want to make the argument that any consistent ethics and politics of nonviolence in education, regardless of social or political conditions in Korea, in the United States, in South Africa, and so on, must be grounded in a relentless critique of all forms of violence and the recognition of our shared human vulnerability and relationality, but also our complicity to this violence. In other words, without a closer scrutinization of how we are all complicit in various forms of violence, some more visible, others less so, it is not possible to eventually choose nonviolence as the preferred pathway. The purpose of my talk then is to examine how these ideas can serve as a productive entry point into enriching our understandings of ethical and political responses to violence in the context of education, and especially in renewing our pedagogies for nonviolence in the aftermath of this pandemic. And I will explain soon what I mean by the term pedagogies for nonviolence. To do so, my talk is divided into three parts. First, I provide a brief discussion of nonviolence and its different approaches in education. Second, I draw on Judith Butler's philosophy to examine more closely the connections between affect, ethics, and nonviolence, and underscore the crucial role of affects and emotions in a nonviolent approach to social transformation. And finally, I focus on how pedagogies for nonviolence in education may be renewed in response to the lessons learned from the pandemic. I'd like to start with a discussion of some competing meanings of nonviolence. Although nonviolence as a philosophy and practice has existed for thousands of years throughout the world, especially in various traditions and religions such as Taoism, Hinduism, and Christianity, nonviolence in modern history has been mostly associated with the political movements led by Mohandas Gandhi and Martin Luther King. In particular, the 20th century has seen nonviolence moved from being rooted in religious beliefs to serving as a political tool for social change. Given its mass appeal to thinkers and activists from a range of theologies, philosophies, and theories, nonviolence in the context of education has functioned as an attractive idea for advancing a vision of peace and justice. It is important to highlight here that scholars in various sectors of education, peace education, social justice education, and human rights education, to name a few, have advocated that nonviolence provides a useful platform to promote pedagogical ideas and practices grounded in the notion of not doing harm to others, especially those who are marginalized. An important contribution of nonviolent approaches in the context of education comes from works that center on cultivating inner peace and compassionate relationships. These works argue that if educators develop in students the capacity to denounce and prevent violence through personal cultivation and self-transformation, then students' moral responsibility towards others will be developed. The focus of pedagogies of nonviolence then should be on cultivating practices such as nonviolent relationship with the self and a relational dynamic that draws out the compassionate and loving side of humanity to rise above human cruelty and hatred. These ideas, which draw inspiration from Eastern wisdom traditions, conceptualize nonviolence as a daily practice of each individual person that aims at self-transformation and inner peace. Although approaches that turn our attention to the individual's practices of nonviolence make an important contribution to formulating pedagogies for nonviolence, they may inevitably background how personal motivations are entangled with power dynamics. In other words, it is not certain that individuals will make nonviolent choices if they cultivate capacities for inner peace and compassion. Therefore, I would argue that it is important to find ways to include in nonviolent approaches to education an appreciation for political force of nonviolence. Here is precisely where Judith Butler's recent work might be useful. Let me begin by saying that Butler has always made it clear that a central aspect of violence is its varying visibility. Violence is often misrecognized, made invisible, or it is not recognized at all. Importantly, Butler does not draw a demarcation between violence and non-violence, but rather she sees them as entangled, which makes all of us complicit in manifestations of violence and social injustice. This is why Butler is so adamant that non-violence ought to be understood not only in ethical, but also in political terms. Furthermore, Butler makes the point that we are all dependent on others and thus compelled to engage with them in ways that are responsible and responsive to that vulnerability, that is, in relations of nonviolence. All of us may inflict or suffer from violence. This is why the call for nonviolence makes sense as a way of struggling against that violence. Importantly, the struggle for nonviolence is not an individual one, but rather depends on community ethos and collective responsibility. Nonviolence then is invoked as a struggle against the urge of violence, as the interruption of violence. In this respect, Butler's notion of nonviolence must be understood as political action that strives to interrupt or suspend violence. Butler's analysis of nonviolence in his recent book, The Force of Nonviolence, highlights nonviolence as an ethical and political act that confronts systemic violence and inequality. In this sense, violence is a critical stance and a performative action that makes violence visible. This is especially important in the context of social and political movements such as Black Lives Matter, striving for social justice and inequality, or realizations about forms of violence inflicted on many communities, such as discrimination of poor communities or minorities during these times of pandemic. As Butler argues, a politics of nonviolence must always be engaged in a relentless critical resistance to the norms that distinguish between what she calls grievable and less grievable or ungrievable lives. For example, the practice of nonviolence in these pandemic times requires a collective opposition to forms of discrimination and exclusion that have been exacerbated during these times, but have always been distinguished lives worth safeguarding from those that are not. Importantly then, Butler turns our attention to something that is usually left unaddressed or is treated in uncritical ways when we talk about violence and non-violence. And this is the necessity of considering the affective dimensions of violence and the affective conditions that maintain and support a consistent politics of nonviolence as resistance. It is to this discussion of this issue that I turn next. A central theme in Butler's work since 2004 is how the subject responds ethically and politically to norms that are produced to regulate behavior and action through governing our affects and emotions for political purposes. The norms that govern our lives generate affective structures or structures of feeling, to use Raymond Williams' known term. This has become vividly evident in these times of pandemic, with the numerous lockdowns imposed in many countries in the name of safety and health, the fear and insecurity which have come to regulate our lives, and the various forms of violence inflicted on us as a result of restrictions. These affective responses are implicated in the perpetuation of violence by distinguishing between livable and thus grievable lives from non-livable and thus non-grievable lives. How we recognize and respond to violence, in other words, depends on the differential framing of violence within the social and political structures of livability and vulnerability. This framing is crucial not only for our affective responses to violence, but also whether we will interrupt or further extend violence. The examples abound. The violence that European states inflict against migrants at the border or at sea, very often letting them die rather than allowing them to enter the territory under international law, justifies itself by claiming that migrants are threats to the nation. The violence that many states have inflicted against vulnerable communities, poor people, and minorities during the pandemic, very often leaving them helpless without health care. Finally, the violence that the rich countries around the world have inflicted against poorer countries by rushing to take all the vaccines for themselves. Butler gives us a new perspective to think about violence and non-violence in post-pandemic times by offering an account of how to translate this relationality to which we all bound into collective resistance, namely a practice of non-violence that turns affect, such as outrage against injustice, into a sustained political action. Butler is careful not to present this as an isolated struggle, but rather she considers the political power of nonviolence as an intervention in violence's everyday visibility. Butler is also careful not to privilege nonviolence as the only form of resistance, either strategically or morally. This form of resistance arises from the outrage necessary to combat social injustice in all of its manifestations. In this struggle, it is important to nurture solidarities advocating that all lives can and must be equally valued. Now, on to the last part of my talk. How can such an account of nonviolence be helpful in complicating our pedagogical approaches on nonviolence? What does a pragmatic, non-utopian approach in education look like in these times of pandemic? I argue that Butler's account of nonviolence offers two crucial insights that have pedagogical value. The first insight emphasizes the need to pay attention to the affective dimensions of nonviolence as resistance. This insight enriches approaches of nonviolence as inner work and self-transformation. The second insight highlights that a crucial issue that needs to be addressed in pedagogies for nonviolence is to navigate through the affective, ethical, and political dynamics of complicity. This insight suggests that handling students' denials of complicity in violence requires a thoughtful pedagogical approach that considers not only how to engage students critically with complicity and its consequences, but also how to invent pedagogical spaces that inspire students to adopt nonviolence as anti-complicity action. To provide more clarity to these two insights, my discussion is presented through an imagined teaching scene in a classroom in which the teacher and his or her students, it could be a secondary school or a university classroom, attempt to make sense of nonviolent and violent protests emerging today in times of pandemic as a response to lockdowns and the neglect of vulnerable communities in many parts of the world. The driving question behind their exploration in the classroom is the following: how can one understand nonviolence in the context of social protests? And what would constitute nonviolence response as resistance in students' everyday lives? To begin with the first insight, I would like to remind you that Butler's account of nonviolence highlights the need to pay attention to nonviolence as resistance as an affective and relational event, rather than merely as an individual act of opposition. This is precisely what opens possibilities for ethical and political critical thought, as well as personal and political transformation. For example, in reference to the emerging teaching scene that I mentioned earlier, this insight implies that before even trying to make sense of nonviolent protests in the context of structural injustices, the teacher and their students need to begin examining how violence is built into the affective and normative field of their own classroom and their everyday lives, on the basis of which perceptions and decisions are made over the allotment of vulnerability. To break this chain, and clearly pedagogy cannot do this alone, the teacher needs to create affective conditions through which students will begin to feel ethically and politically responsible towards others who suffer. That is, to feel they have responsibility to resist collectively to structures of social injustice and violence. This would mean, for example, recognizing that nonviolence as resistance is not a set of individualized actions, but rather nonviolent responses in everyday life are very much embedded in the affective infrastructures of classrooms, schools, and communities. Therefore, if we, and by we I mean teachers, academics, parents, students, want to create renewed affective relations that support nonviolence as resistance, it will require that we begin to invent new affective spaces in classrooms, schools, communities that instigate action against norms of violence in our everyday lives. The second insight on pedagogies of nonviolence emphasizes that the constant risks of complicity must be kept in check so that the affective, political, and ethical conditions that support nonviolence are continually questioned. Acknowledging, for example, that all of us are implicated to various forms of violence, yet not in the same manner, is not an easy thing for students to recognize or accept. Hence, to go back once again to the emerging teaching scene outlined earlier, pedagogical efforts to teach students how to acknowledge their complicity in various forms of violence that perpetuate social injustices in times of pandemic turn out to be a deeply affective process. If a teacher, for instance, attempts to instill moral guilt or shame in students, these attempts will most likely fail. Not only because students will be made to feel that the problem is personal when it is deeply a political one. Most importantly, these attempts will be unsuccessful because they will likely promote a dehistoricized or psychologized account of violence and vulnerability that fails to address the norms and structures of social injustice and violence. Attention to the linkage between affect, ethics, politics, and nonviolence then highlights the value of thinking nonviolence in education as affective practice that attempts to rupture normative practices of violence. Acknowledging the possibility of both resistance and complicity, including their asymmetries, raises important questions that could inspire a reconsideration of pedagogies for nonviolence in various sociopolitical settings. For example, whose lived experiences of violence and vulnerability do teachers and students explore in the classroom? How are complicities symmetrical or asymmetrical for different individuals or groups featured in different forms of violence, both within school settings and beyond those? What can be done to minimize forms of violence and complicity through affective practices of nonviolence, such as solidarity, hospitality, and conviviality? These questions offer a conceptualization of nonviolence as anti-complicity action. That is an ongoing struggle that attempts to bring to the surface hidden aspects of violence and complicity and face them productively by imagining new affective relations with others. This account requires from the teacher to quote unquote translate nonviolence into specific strategies for collective resistance that are critically conscious of the constant risks of complicity. These strategies of nonviolence as resistance could include, for example, the following: educational policies and pedagogical practices that actively oppose forms of violence which perpetuate precarious conditions for vulnerable and marginalized students, students with disabilities, refugee children, migrant children. School and community projects that expand possibilities to form solidarities and take specific actions against recognized forms of violence, such as racism, xenophobia, and homophobia, in schools and local communities. Strategies such as these are important, not only because they cultivate in students anti-complicity attitudes, but also because they do not blame the individual for his or her complicity in violence and social injustices. Rather, these strategies inspire specific acts that explore under which conditions students in their everyday lives may begin to oppose systemic violence that continues to harm people, especially those who are marginalized. To conclude now, helping to foster nonviolence as resistance to violence in the classroom can occur in many forms, often forms that are not irrelevant to the conditions that trigger feelings of ethical responsibility towards others. These feelings, though, as Butler seems to be telling us, must always be conjoined with relentless critical exposure of norms that separate those lives considered to be grievable from those that do not count as such. This critique should eventually engage all of us in meaningful solidarity. Educators can make a significant contribution to nonviolent approach in education by translating these ideas into pedagogies that render violence explicit and visible, formulate effective infrastructures of solidarity in schools, and nurture nonviolence as action that resists or interrupts the repetition of normative violence. This pandemic has created a lot of suffering around the world, but it also gives us a chance to do things differently in the future if we can recast relationality as interdependency and making it an ethics and politics committed to social equality. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Zembylas, for your talk today, highlighting the urgency of social and political thinking to inform approaches to educational inquiry and practice that interrogate social conflict during times of multiple crises and pandemic. We have 3 questions for you. I'm going to ask all 3 questions in one, and then I'll let you respond to them. First, how can we as scholars, teachers, and students practice nonviolence and ethical decision-making within formal educational structures that themselves may not be critical, that may be reproductive of the violences of the status quo? Second, Butler, it seems from your presentation today, and I think of Paulo Freire here as well, they abhor violence, but they do not categorically deny it. That is, could it be a legitimate form for social change? And what do we do with this as educators for social justice? It seems the critical point, in line with peace education and global citizenship education theory and practice, is social action. But what type of social action toward what end? And third, if we are all implicated as educators to different degrees in violences and oppressions, are there then differentiated pedagogies? And I think that you brought this to light today, but perhaps you can go further into discussion. Are there differentiated pedagogies for working differently around nonviolence with different communities? So those are our 3 questions, Professor Zembylas, and we'll open it now for you to respond.
Thank you, Kevin. Excellent questions. Let me start from the last one. If we are implicated, are there any differentiated pedagogies for working differently? And the answer is yes, there are. And this must be defined contextually in the specific socio-political settings in which we are all reside. So, for example, these pedagogies might look differently in Seoul from Nicosia, Cyprus. The idea is to identify how we are implicated, because we are not all implicated in the same manner. And this was one of the points that I tried to make, that there is an asymmetry in the sort of implication that we have in the sum of how we are all complicit in this. So these differentiated pedagogies must be defined contextually, depending on the needs and depending on the specificities of each socio-political setting. And this is why research and scholars and educators in general have such a crucial role to play in identifying which of these pedagogies might be more productive than others. I sketched the overall conceptual and theoretical characteristics of pedagogies for nonviolence, but how those are manifested must be defined contextually. Now, to go to the back to the first question that you asked about how to practice nonviolence when our whole world, the academy, the the educational systems are by definition violent, deeply embedded in violent structures. This is one of the major actual problems that Judith Butler deals with. Violence is doubtful whether we can get rid of it ever, in the sense that there will always be different forms of violence. So the point is, are we able to identify these forms of violence in our social structures, in our educational system, in our school systems, and be critical and find alternative ways of non-violence, such as the ones I described here today, forming solidarities, conviviality, hospitality, and so on. So it's not like there is an end point where one day violence will be completely eliminated. I don't think that's possible. Violence and non-violence will always be together. So the point is, can we identify, make visible those forms of violence, and then discover, invent practices, pedagogies for non-violence that promote non-violence, not at the individual level, but also the social level. And the final question is whether violence can be a force of social change. There are various scholars and theorists that argue that violence can be a viable form of social change, and I wouldn't deny that. Look at Marxist theory and so on. But I was not talking about that today. I was clearly making a distinction, saying that there are possibilities for non-violence to act as a force of social change. So that is the point, because we have been for so long focused on the notion that you need violence to bring any meaningful change. And what I have been arguing today, this is not the only pathway. Yes, this is one pathway, but what I've been arguing today is that non-violence can be an equally valid and powerful force of change. And the pandemic has actually given us the impetus to rethink this, looking at all these different forms of violences that have been manifested on poor populations, marginalized communities, and so on. So we have an opportunity to reconceptualize our understanding of violence and non-violence on a different framework.
Thank you, Michalinos, for this very thoughtful and fruitful discussion today. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time, and we must wrap up here in a moment. But would everybody please join me in giving a big round of applause to Professor Zembylas.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michalinos. Thank you all very much.
Bye.